DW Africa Link.
Travel bans, asset freezes, years of diplomatic strain. For more than 20 years, Zimbabwe operated under European Union sanctions. Now, that chapter is changing. The EU has lifted most of its targeted measures, signaling a new phase of engagement. So is this the breakthrough Harare has been waiting for? A chance to rebuild trust, attract investment, and reset its global image? Most importantly, will this shift make a real difference in the lives of ordinary Zimbabweans? That's what's coming up. I am Eddy Micah Jr, and you are welcome to Africa Link, the podcast connecting you to the stories that matter.
Africa Link, every weekday here on DW.
The European Union first imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe in 2002 during the late Robert Mugabe's rule. Now, this was in response to disputed elections, political violence, land seizures, and serious human rights concerns. For more than 2 decades, those sanctions shaped Zimbabwe's foreign relations and its economic narrative. The government blamed them for the country's economic collapse. Critics, however, pointed to mismanagement, corruption, and unstable policies as the deeper causes. Still, many ordinary Zimbabweans felt the impact through reduced investment, fewer jobs, and an economy already under strain. For more insight, I'm joined by Gibson Nyikadzino, a politics and international relations analyst in Zimbabwe, and DW correspondent Privilege Musvanhiri. Welcome to Africa Link, both of you. Gibson, so after more than 2 decades, the EU is lifting most of its sanctions on Zimbabwe. That sounds like good news. How significant is this?
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Ed. I think from what you've just asked, this is a representation, political representation in terms of rapprochement between the EU and Zimbabwe. So in terms of a political development moving towards a harmonious relationship with a careful consideration, because this is just being done, one, to improve engagement and re-engagement, but also at the same time to deepen mutual trust after years of diplomatic conflict. So the first reaction probably is this might be a good starting point to build political and diplomatic trust between the two parties.
Right. That's your initial way of looking at it. But why do I sense some sort of skepticism in your tone, or is it just me?
You say skepticism, but it is more of a cautious approach to this element of engagement between Zimbabwe and the EU. Because remember, from 2002, a lot of things they have changed in terms of the global architecture in the world. Back then, we understand the United States was primarily the most dominant country in the world. But now, when you look, there are different shifts in terms of the rise of China, Russia, India, and BRICS, among other global developments. So it is not skepticism, but it is something that I'm looking at cautiously because some spaces that the European Union governments left in Zimbabwe, already they've been occupied by the Chinese, especially maybe in terms of investments, in terms of humanitarian assistance, in terms of cooperation, and in terms of bilateral deals. So this is a response to the emerging political order that we are witnessing, which has shifted and changed a lot of diplomatic dynamics between the two parties.
That only means good news for Zimbabwe, because now it's not just dealing with a few countries. Now they have the chance to deal with even more countries to increase or multiply or double their relations with other countries. Wouldn't that be beneficial to Zimbabwe?
Of course, we also need to look at it as a mutual relationship, because if the EU was not set to benefit from this engagement, there wouldn't be any reason for them to lift the restrictions, to lift the sanctions, to lift the asset freeze and the travel ban. But I'll tell you something. Last year in November, I was in Sweden. I was talking to the director of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and he was telling me at a time when the EU was having its meeting with the AU in Angola, he was saying, it seems the European Union is losing Africa to China and to Russia and other emerging powers. So that alone, it tells you that the action by the European Union, it does not only mean Zimbabwe is going to be benefiting alone because it is going to be dealing with more countries, but also there are moves which the European Union itself, the moves which it is making, so that it also generates some benefit, especially in terms of resource benefits. So I think we also need to look at this as a two-way. Of course, the benefit might not be as huge as we would want to look at a single country which is dealing with a bloc with 27 countries. That's a huge market to fulfill. Maybe it could be in trade terms or in diplomatic terms. I understand that there is a broadening of cooperation, but also this cooperation is mutual.
Mutually beneficial relationship is what the hope will be.
Just like many other countries which are looking at making relations with Africa, you can talk of the India Africa, China Africa, Turkey Africa, Japan Africa, recently South Korea Africa. So almost all countries are reshifting their diplomatic focus, especially towards Africa, and it doesn't make sense for the EU to remain stuck in a political challenge that happened over 2 decades ago when the world is actually moving in another direction.
Privilege, I've not forgotten about you at all. I know you've been keenly listening to the discussion, and I first want to get your immediate reaction to this, especially after speaking to other ordinary Zimbabweans when they heard this news. What's the overall reaction like?
Thanks, Eddie. I'll start maybe from the Zimbabwe government itself. The government's reaction has been that they've welcomed this development. Listening to the Zimbabwe Foreign Affairs Minister speaking days after the EU had announced, he said, Zimbabwe, like at the moment, there is a mantra that the country is moving with to say Zimbabwe is a friend to all and an enemy to none. And then he says the country has adopted a non-adversarial and non-judgmental stance. So if anything, Zimbabwe welcomes any country that improves relations with it. So that's the reaction of the Zimbabwean government. Then coming to the ordinary citizens, it is very interesting that, all this debate about sanctions gained traction maybe in the early years, but as the years went by, even 10, 15 years after that, we had heated political moments in Zimbabwe where probably we had disputed elections. You had what even the EU was calling gross human rights violations in Zimbabwe, where the claims of targeting of opposition and civic society. All that phase, has come and gone, and it has come. The issue of sanctions, Zimbabweans had kind of adopted a stance where it's an everyday life. They don't care about what is happening, but what they care is the bread and butter and things that affect them on an everyday basis. So if you ask an ordinary Zimbabwean today to say that, what do you think about EU lifting sanctions. It sounds very peripheral to them.
The European Union's decision to lift the remaining travel restrictions on Zimbabwe is a symbolic step towards re-engagement. But symbolism must now translate into tangible benefits for ordinary Zimbabweans. Sanctions have long been used as both a diplomatic tool and a political talking point, often with limited impact on governance reform, but real consequences for economic confidence and investment. From my perspective, the conversation should move beyond sanctions politics towards rebuilding Zimbabwe's credibility through good governance, economic stability, and citizen-centered policies. True normalization is not granted externally, it is earned internally through reforms that restore trust between the state, citizens, and the international community.
We welcome, we are quite happy with the position of the European Union on its lifting of sanctions, that is the travel restrictions, and the lifting of all assets freeze, targeted assets freeze. Though we are still not happy with their maintenance of the arms embargo, it's actually quite surprising that in the 21st century, a small country like Zimbabwe could still be sanctioned. It clearly shows that the European Union and its allies do not want to see Zimbabwe growing. They do not want to see us standing on our own 2 feet. But we are happy that through the engagement and re-engagement policy of our government and the activities of the civic society organizations and activists, they are actually taking our plight and they have actually removed those sanctions that they removed. And we hope that in the future they are going to remove all sanctions which they imposed on Zimbabwe.
Now the politicians cannot keep crying about sanctions. Now we know that these are conditions that can be eventually lifted. The ruling party has been using sanctions as a scapegoat when it comes to issues of delivering, because they've been saying we cannot do such and such because we are being hit in this way economically. Now, if the sanctions are being lifted, people will begin to see what kind of sanctions were really there and what kind of limitations our government is actually been having. Now it's no longer about the political talk, it's about the reality on the ground. For the arms embargo, we understand it's arms, but the other sanctions, I think it's going to be hard for the ruling elite to run away from this one.
Excitement or not?
That's the kind of reaction. It's mixed. To those that are enlightened, maybe politically enlightened, they are the ones who are tuned to these developments. But to an ordinary person who is on the street, it's something that is peripheral to them, because at the end of the day, if we are talking of lifting of restrictive measures on travel, it was affecting the political elite, not the ordinary person. And then when it comes then to maybe probably these EU sanctions, the sanctions were affecting Zimbabwe in some way, but I think the government of Zimbabwe, yes, would say sanctions are affecting Zimbabwe, but it was a bit of a trouble in terms of breaking it down for an ordinary person to understand how the sanctions are affecting them. So that's why there is that mixed reaction.
It's interesting what you're saying, and also a very important point. Help us understand what the overall EU sanctions, which has been there for over 2 decades, what impact it had on ordinary Zimbabweans, and what the lifting of sanctions would mean for the ordinary Zimbabwean, so we can understand the sort of major difference to expect.
Right. If we look at the sanctions that were imposed on Zimbabwe, they had a huge impact in terms of Zimbabwe accessing credit lines for any developments, particularly development in Zimbabwe. So you find the EU, of course, would pour in money into Zimbabwe. It is directed, maybe say, to the civic society. It is directed to some development cooperation, which would not ordinarily mean that they are dealing directly with the government. So there was no funding which was going directly to the government. Secondly, it had an impact or in terms of Zimbabwe's credit rating and also its image in terms of wanting to borrow anything internationally. So you find that that was some kind of blacklisting. So as long as Zimbabwe sanctions were on Zimbabwe, it was then a bit difficult to negotiate, maybe probably with an EU member, because decisions are made as a bloc. So at the end of the day, individual countries would not be able to get into maybe development cooperation or bilateral relations that were direct, because they decide as a bloc. So this was the impact it had on the ordinary Zimbabwean. So some of the things that could have accrued maybe over the years was to say, if Zimbabwe probably, if it was accessing direct development cooperation or credit lines, it would have aided in some development of the economy. So Zimbabwe had to, that's why Zimbabwe, you heard from Gibson to say, Zimbabwe had to look elsewhere. Zimbabwe adopted what they say, adopted what they said, it's an look east policy. Then they strengthened their relations with your China, Russia, and like. It all stemmed from there.
Back to you, Gibson, picking it up from where Privilege left off, because it's easy to blame Zimbabwe's economic crisis on EU sanctions and other international sanctions. Can you help us understand, though, how much of Zimbabwe's economic challenge was actually caused by EU sanctions?
I just want to disagree a little first with Privilege before I answer a question, by highlighting that the issues to do with the sanctions, they remained peripheral to the ordinary person. I think sanctions are not in the periphery to the ordinary person, because the bottom line is that the sanctions were a response to Zimbabwe's land reform program. So the bulk of the people, they know that Zimbabweans were being punished for reclaiming their territory, which is the land. But back to your question, there is a lot of things which we can look at in terms of looking at the economic challenges, which cannot entirely be looked with one lens, that is to say the sanctions from the EU or sanctions from the United States or any other Western country. But we also need to look at the flight of investments. Remember, from 1980, the bulk of companies that had the economic interests which were viable in Zimbabwe were owned by the British. So besides the sanctions, there was a capital flight. Zimbabwe is the only country in Africa that experienced a biggest capital flight in for a country which was not at war. So this contributes to the issue of economic challenges. But also when such things happen, historically or traditionally, history informs that people become restless in terms of desiring to have service provision, but also at the same time, this entrenches the issues of mismanagement, because the administrators will be trying to cover the gaps which were opened as a result of the flight of the investors who were originally there.
No doubt that the sanctions affected ordinary folks in Zimbabwe. The question then is, now that most of these sanctions have been lifted, are the better days ahead? Is that automatic? And that question is addressed to you, Gibson.
Well, for a start, I think it is important to highlight that when institutions make decisions, it does not necessarily mean that these decisions are operationalized by the end of the day or by the end of the month or by the end of the year. It might take time, because from what has been happening, it is an issue about trust. It is an issue about restoring the previous ties. And at the same time, it is an issue about Zimbabwe and the EU also realizing that Britain is a former member of the EU, it might have internationalized a bilateral disagreement. So now Britain is no longer part of the EU. The EU is now left to deal with Zimbabwe alone. So this is quite a lot of things. Of course, there are expectations that we have positively that can be born out of this new relationship, but also there are challenges to do with the operationalization of this removal of sanctions.
So in a sense, yes, I think you make a valid point there. It all depends on the government actions moving forward, proper implementation, and that is what is going to contribute to positively impacting the lives of people inside Zimbabwe. Now, we do know that there's still an arms embargo that is in place. What message do you think Brussels is sending?
Oh, thank you. I think that question is timely because just 2 weeks ago, I spoke with the head of the EU delegation to Zimbabwe, the ambassador, Madame Catherine Hegman, and she told me that the ban does not necessarily affect Zimbabwe, but it affects European companies because they are the ones which are being restricted from doing business with Zimbabwe, of which Zimbabwe, since the time of this arms embargo, it has been receiving, I think if you check for the past 2 years, 3 years, Zimbabwe has been receiving military equipment, vehicles, and other things of military kind from other markets. If you remember, in 2023, Russia, it pledged that it is going to deploy one of its helicopters or choppers to Zimbabwe. So there is already a market Zimbabwe already has occupied in the absence of the EU. And if only the arms embargo had been lifted, not entirely to say it is on Zimbabwe, but according to the words of Madame Hegman, the embargo is directly affecting the manufacturing sales of European companies. So I think at a time when businesses are going the other way in terms of new markets being established, it is key that in the future, it is my hope that the EU and Zimbabwe will begin to trade, will begin to exchange economic engagements without any hindrance in terms of restrictive measures or any bans.
Thanks a lot for that, Gibson. Privilege, basically, as Gibson has been highlighting, can we expect that countries like the UK, US, or other regional blocks might follow the EU's lead and lift sanctions on Zimbabwe?
Thanks, Ed. Definitely, this is something to follow and watch. I think developments have already started to happen. Our listeners may want to know that the US had what they call the ZIDERA act on Zimbabwe, and there are indications already to get rid of that and normalize relations with Zimbabwe. We have seen other countries, of course, warming up. So I think it's a question of watching the days and see the developments.
It's a great development, to say the least. The work begins now, right? It's a statement that has been made, but the actions that are put in place or the actions that are taken will determine how great this really is. And I'm going to keep my eyes and ears on this one. And I'm sure I'll have both of you to delve into the topic again based on how things have drastically changed or not for Zimbabwe. So fingers crossed on that. Gibson Nyikadzino, a politics and international relations analyst in Zimbabwe, and DW correspondent Privilege Musvanhiri in Zimbabwe. Thanks to you both for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you so much, Eddy.
My pleasure.
For ordinary Zimbabweans, any benefits are likely to be gradual and indirect. More aid, investment, or trade could eventually create jobs and improve services. Sanctions are tools, not solutions. Lifting them may remove friction, but it doesn't automatically create growth or deepen democracy. So the real test now isn't in Brussels, it's in Harare. Zimbabwe will have to turn this diplomatic thaw into real reform, real confidence, and real opportunity for its people. What do you think? Share your thoughts with us on Facebook at DW Africa. Listen on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to our DW Africa YouTube channel so you never miss an episode. This show was co-produced and edited by Isaac Mugabe, and I am Eddy Micah Jr. Thanks for listening.
DW, made for minds.